Why did you decide to run for the first congressional district?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. And the reason that I ran for the first congressional district is because I wanted my opinion to matter. I had a political voice and I thought it was important. And beyond voting, the best thing that I thought I could do was to run for office. So I chose this particular office because I have a family legacy. I have a great great grandfather who was a congressman. And I've learned a lot about his life and the things that he did and the motivations that brought him to run for Congress, and a lot of the same things and the ideals that he had, I hold today.
What are those some like motivations and ideals?
Really, the basic concept is that we have a government of, by, and for the people. And so when people talk about politics or they talk about the government, they sometimes fail to realize that we are the government. And this particular position I'm running for, in fact, is only a 2-year term. So many people don't realize that the House of Representatives is truly the people's house. And it's designed to have a confluence of ideas, a diversity of ideas in 2-year terms. So I think this is a great opportunity for me to change the narrative and to provide some opportunities for Oregon and Oregonians that they haven't seen in quite some time.
Yeah, and what are the main issues you're going to focus on?
Wow, that's a great question because there's so many issues, as you know, that come up, and it seems like every day or every week there's a new issue. Right now, people's health and safety are the most important things. I think people are concerned about their families and their families' futures from a number of different perspectives, from the COVID virus to what's happening with our educational system, and what's happening in our society. So law and order, and I think basic community safety are really the backbone of my of my platform this year, but it's much broader than that. I really want to bring affordability and hope to younger folks. I'm very concerned about the cost of housing and the cost of education for young people, and I want to be able to improve on that by providing good opportunities for home ownership and home mobility, meaning moving from one area to another without having to incur a huge cost, especially when you're young. You should be able to explore the opportunities in front of you. So I don't want people to be passed over, particularly young people in Oregon. And I'm a very big proponent of the U.S. Space Force, which is a recent addition to the U.S. military services or U.S. armed services. And it's a very, very exciting opportunity, not only for young people, but for high school age kids to really have a future eye on what they can do with an educational background in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So I always say to people, if you don't like this world, join the U.S. Space Force and go find one you do like.
Do you have any specific plans already in place on how to help with education and public safety?
Yeah, that is a really, really great question because, there's a term called paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is when your set of beliefs is basically changed or shifted dramatically or drastically. And, you can react to that in a lot of different ways. But you're seeing that with our educational system right now, where people have no choice but to think of alternative ideas. So my idea is very simple and very consistent, is that families pay taxes to support the education system, which goes generally to public schools. I think that those dollars should be diverted back to the families in the form of either lower taxes or direct subsidies so that families can choose the educational system that's best for them. People with special needs are a perfect example. There's such a broad range and spectrum. You can't even put everybody under one category and call them special needs. It's individualized education and learning, and the only people to decide who's best to do that are the families and the parents and the children. So I think that the educational dollars should follow the families, and the families should have the choice as to where and how they educate their kids. So that's one very important platform.
Why should your constituents vote for you instead of the incumbent, Susan Bonamici?
Yeah, Suzanne Bonamici. So she's a Democrat. She's a liberal. She's been in office for 8 years. So I would just say, are you better off today than you were 2, 4, 6, or 8 years ago? Most people would say that Oregon's in a pretty precarious position. So it really takes somebody with a different vision, a little bit more strength, a little bit more sense of leadership, and someone who can really rely on the strength of Oregon and Oregonians rather than the strength of the government to support us, right? We're going to have to build our way out of these disasters and fires. And the way we're going to have to do that is to scrape the land and start rebuilding those homes as quickly as possible with Oregon timber and Oregon lumber. We need to fix our economy. We need to provide jobs and housing locally. And we need to do that for Oregonians and Americans first. And I'm very, very strong on immigration policies. I don't think that there is any reason whatsoever that Americans should be put on the back burner to people who come in here and essentially steal educational or housing opportunities from Americans. So that's a controversial position. I'm not a racist. I'm not a xenophobe, but we have borders for reasons, and I respect those borders.
Yeah, what do you think about the Dreamers Act? Since we already invested in the children immigrants that grew up during the act, what do you think we should do?
Yeah, so with DACA, I think that really until every American has an opportunity for an education, that the Dreamers should be put on a back burner. There's absolutely no reason, no compelling reason that just because on an emotional basis they came here and stole an opportunity from an American child or an American family or an American young person, that we should have sympathy for them. It's not our role as Americans. And I will say this, because it goes back to your first question. So the role of a U.S. House of Representatives in Oregon, there are 5 districts. So the entire state of Oregon is divided up into 5 district areas. I have a very distinct portion of Northwest Oregon, which I represent. So that is my primary responsibility, those 5 counties, Clatsop, Columbia, Yamhill, Washington, and Multnomah. One of the most beautiful places in the world. So besides the politics and the people and all that, it is literally one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I'm honored to represent it. So I have these 5 counties as my primary responsibility. My secondary responsibility, and really not secondary, but along with the first responsibility, is the entire state of Oregon, right? So they're my secondary responsibility because I really have to represent the Northwest District, the first district. And then beyond that, of course, the American people. So I have primary, secondary, and tertiary responsibilities, which have huge overlaps. Part of that responsibility is not the welfare of foreign citizens. Other than how it interacts with our American immigration policy, I have to focus on my primary responsibility, which is the citizens of the first district of the state of Oregon, the citizens of the state of Oregon overall, and American citizens. That's what the role is. That's what the job is.
Yeah. So you mentioned your great-great-grandfather, Congressman Omer Madison Kem, inspired you to run. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a great story. I come from a family of many, many, many generations of Americans predating the Civil War, actually, and the Revolutionary War. So my family goes way back. Omer Madison Kem was my great-great-grandfather. He was my mother's father's father, and he was a congressman from the state of Nebraska in 1890. He had been a farmer, and farmers were unfairly put upon and unfairly, they thought, discriminated against, for lack of a better term, by the railroad people who would basically aggregate the farmers at the time their crops were harvested and take advantage of them all by lowering their prices. So they got together, this Grange group of farmers, and they became what later became the progressive movement and later the populist movement. So he was actually elected to Congress as a populist and served 3 terms. Part of what the populists did was they had a very progressive platform. At that point, women did not have the right to vote, and they actually forwarded that in the 1890s, and it was actually turned down by the Congress. It was later ratified, of course, in the 1900s, but they were one of the first people to propose the voting rights for women, property ownership rights for women. The recall and referendum and initiative process was something that came through the populists. So they had some very, very specific ideals on how they wanted to run the country. And they were one of the only few successful, although short-lived, third-party platforms that was for a short period of time successful in the United States. So he was independent. He basically thought that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats were doing this very good. He thought that the country was turning into moral and economic ruin, and he decided to take action, and he ran for Congress. And he won, and he went as a farmer to Washington and did a number of incredible things there that he didn't get direct responsibility for, but he planted the seed for later generations. That's kind of how politics works. It's a long, slow process.
Yeah. And so, he was the man of the people. When you're visiting the different counties that you're going to represent, what issues are people talking to you about? What are they most concerned about?
Wow, that really is a great question. So it depends. It depends on who you talk to. But I think overall, right now, um, people want to have more certainty in their lives. The biggest conflict I think there is in Oregon is that we have a Democratic state government and we have a Republican federal government. So the citizens are sort of torn between their federal obligation in some cases and their state obligation. For example, I have a group I represent called Timber Unity. They're a very politically active group, and they have a lot to say in Oregon. And so trying to get their constituency and their message out at the state level and at the federal level are two different approaches, right? Because you have state Democratic government that want one thing and you have federal government that wants timber management handled in a different way. Well, we've just seen with the wildfires what Democratic practices have done. And so again, we propose an alternative. So I guess the biggest thing for me is that if you're going to have because this is a 2-year term, if you anticipate having a Democratic president and Democratic Senate and Democratic Congress, you should have a Democratic Congress. But if you anticipate having a Republican, it should be Republican all the way through, because we'd be able to have much better representation for the state of Oregon. So the biggest thing that people are talking to me about right now is just having their voice heard, having somebody who listens to them and tries to do the best that they can for them, not for the political interests of their party.
Yeah, and do you think that Hillsboro is shifting toward the politics of Portland? Hillsboro's becoming more liberal and going to turn into Portland, so to
Yeah,
speak?
so great question. Hillsboro and Washington County in particular are an interesting place. It's grown dynamically and it's changed dynamically in the last 10 or 20 years, and you could argue back and forth about whether those are good or bad things. The thing is, Mark Twain, I think, once said, they ain't making no more land, right? So we, and especially in my district, I feel a very important need to represent all of the voters of the first congressional district. And I really need the help of people in Washington and Multnomah County to understand their sense of stewardship. With this vote, they have a sense of stewardship, whether they're a Democrat or Republican or independent. They can help to protect a very, very important and beautiful part of Oregon. That's Northwest Oregon. And counties like Clatsop and Columbia and Yamhill County and all the opportunities they provide for us recreationally, economically, and otherwise, we will not be able to continue to have if this creeps out to the coast, right? We're not going to have any more land left. It's all going to be developed. So how we manage that and how we work with that is very, very important. And that's why we need, as a congressional district, the people in Portland and Washington County to set aside their political differences and to vote somebody in who can really make the right changes that'll help this region grow in a consistent and controlled way, not in an out of control way.
Yeah, and how has your experience in work or just throughout your life made you prepared to serve your constituents and serve the congressional
Yeah,
district?
great question. So I mentioned my great-great-grandfather and the legacy that I have there, which is literally a sort of a written legacy that I have and sort of a roadmap. So that's been a great impetus. But I've also run for city council before, unsuccessfully, many years ago, in another city that I lived in. So that was a good education, got me involved in the process. But it just all comes back to, I think that politics really is the voice of the people. We are a government of, by, and for the people. You shouldn't be afraid to run. The position I'm running for, I'm in my 50s, and you only have to be in your mid-20s to be able to run for this. So if I could do anything whatsoever, it would be to get Oregonians to understand that the role of this job, a House of Representatives being a 2-year term, is something that shouldn't last for, in one case, one guy's had it for 18 terms or 34 years, right? A 2-year job for 34 years. In all that time, we could have had 18 other different points of view and 18 other potential leaders come to the forefront. So voters have to be bold. They have to understand that this is a really, really important time for them. It's a really important time for our state, and they really have an opportunity to make a change, or to not make a change. And then everything, the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over again and hoping that you're hoping for a different result. Well, we're not going to have a different result unless we adopt change. And that's why I want people to vote for Chris Christensen for Congress.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that you're for the people because you're a regular person yourself. So could you explain your history? Like, how did you come to Oregon? What do you do? And your hope in
Yeah, great
Oregon?
question. So I am definitely not, a rich millionaire or a career politician. I don't do this for a living. I just jumped into it this year back in March, and it's kind of evolved and snowballed into an amazing process. It evolves every day. As for myself, my family, as I said, I've been here. We've got 5 generations ahead of me that have lived here in Oregon. Some really creative, dynamic family members who bring a lot of history to me. I was actually born in Ohio when my dad was working back east, and then we came back here when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I've lived in Portland ever since. So I went to kindergarten through high school in Northwest Portland. I went to Chapman Elementary School, 1st through 8th grade, when they had 1st through 8th grade, and then I went to Lincoln High School for my freshman and sophomore years, and then transferred to Jesuit High School in Beaverton or Portland for my junior and senior year. So I graduated from Jesuit High School. And from there, I went down to college in San Diego area, University of San Diego. And so I have a lot of experience. I want to just touch on that because that's what brings me a very unique perspective for Oregonians is understanding the dynamics of living on the border. And I understand the politics and the dynamics extremely well, which is why this federal role is perfectly made out for me. So I have sort of one foot in Oregon, where I've been a native for many years, but I've also spent time traveling, living in California, some other areas as well. Professionally, I worked as a small business owner. Right now, I'm campaigning full time for Congress. So this is an all or nothing opportunity. It's not a part-time thing for me. For the next 45 days, I'm doing everything I can to win every single vote. Prior to this, or just leading up to this, I was working for a global automobile manufacturing company out of their local Hillsboro office, and it afforded me sort of the flexibility to begin the campaign. But as I said, I'm no longer doing that. I'm campaigning full time until November 3rd, when I hope to be elected and go to Washington in January. So I'm literally, ready to go. I'm locked. I'm packed. I'm ready. Have my whole life dedicated to this, and all I need to do is to build an army of about 250,000 people to back me, so that we can bring change to Portland and Oregon and Washington. So I've also been an affordable housing advocate. I've been a development consultant in redevelopment and urban infill redevelopment. So I'm a specialist in housing, urban development, urban redevelopment, permitting, subdivisions. That's kind of a different world. I was also involved in work for all the major international banks and mortgage finance. So I have a very strong understanding of consumer finance, mortgage finance, automobile finance, credit card finance, and what gets people into problems that I can solve. So I'm going to be the advocate for the little guy in trying to fight those fights when they're going up against the mortgage company or the automobile company or the credit card company, because my office will be able to help. Again, my primary responsibility is for the citizens of the 5 counties I mentioned, and I plan to have a very, very hands-on approach so people can call me, email me, and come to me with their problems or issues, and we can help to find a solution.
Yeah, and so how are you going to fix the housing crisis? Like, you talked about affordable housing, and we have that now, but I don't think it's working. So how are you going to fix that?
So it's a big question, right? Affordable housing. So we got to break up housing. There's home ownership and there's rental housing, right? And then there's affordable housing. And affordable housing, if you look at the guidelines, they're what they call median income groups. So you have very low to medium to moderate to high, and you have all different median income groups. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of government overlay and red tape around housing. Housing is pretty simple. In Oregon, we got to do 2 things right now. We got to scrape everything away and get back to bare dirt, and we got to start to rebuild. And when we rebuild, we're going to use Portland cement and Oregon timber to rebuild. We're going to stimulate Oregon jobs, Oregon construction, Oregon economy, Oregon materials, and some people might call that nationalistic, but that's how we built this state, and that's how we built this country. So we need to basically start getting busy, which I know people are already doing, but politicians especially, instead of thinking about handouts and giveaway programs and grants and loans, we need to think about getting people back in their homes. And that's the most important thing. What I don't want to see is like a hurricane disaster where we bring in a bunch of FEMA trailers and we have FEMA trailers sitting along I-5 for 40 miles in Southern Oregon. No, we're gonna use Oregon timber and Oregon lumber, and we're gonna use Oregon mills to cut that lumber and make that lumber, and we're gonna build those houses as quickly as we can and get this country, get this state built back again, as good or better than it was, as fast as we can.
Yeah, and to do that, we're going to need money. What is your position on taxes in general, and when should the people be taxed and when shouldn't
Yeah,
they?
so that is a great question again, and I will say that this again, thank you to the Republican administration and President Trump. I don't know if you know this, but he approved a major disaster declaration for the state of Oregon in record time. Now that was the same week he got nominated for a Nobel Prize. I don't know. He did like 3 or 4 other things that week. It's hard to keep track of the amazing accomplishments this person did. But to go back to your question, it wasn't our Oregon delegation that did it. These people went to hat in hand to the president, and they have been mean and nasty and disgraceful and discouraging, and they've done everything they can to stand in this man's way until they need money for their state. And what did he do? Was he retribution? Did he show malice? No. He quickly and very, very generously gave the money that the citizens of Oregonians need, because President Trump cares about the citizens of America. He could put aside politics for that. So we need to get away from the idea that the state and federal Democratic delegation is helping us. They're hurting us. What is helping us is the federal dollars. So we have a lot of opportunity now with FEMA money, but that can also come in and be a huge distraction, because anytime there's a lot of government money thrown around, there's a lot of opportunity for waste and abuse. So the best thing that we can do is to get the money in the hands of people, like I said, the real people that are going to scrape the dirt and start to rebuild the houses. So we need direct payments directly to builders, developers, and homeowners, directly through grant programs through FEMA at the federal level, and that's the fastest way people will get their lives back on track. If we get the local and state government into it, they're going to put so much red tape and so much bureaucracy on the rebuilding of these homes that they will be so expensive and so time consuming that they will never get built again.
Yeah, and so what do you think about the voter mail-in ballots? There's been talk of voter fraud. Do you think it's significant enough to change over to voting in person?
Yeah, absolutely. So you probably, young Republicans don't remember that for years and years and years, it was almost like a different holiday for America, going down to the voting booths. And you basically have a house in your neighborhood or somewhere down the street where it'd be your precinct. And you go down there sometime and you'd go into the booth and you do your poll. But what was important about that is you did it in privacy, right? You went and you checked in, you let them know who you were, you went to the booth, you got your card, you filled it out, and you gave it right back to the people. So the chain of ownership was very, very short. You're in the booth, you're there, nobody's influencing you, and you give it to the people and you hope they do the right thing with it, right? Now what they're going to do is they're going to vote, they're going to mail something out. You have to get in the mail, hoping it goes to your right address, hoping you haven't burned up by the fire or moved or something else like that, hoping you actually get it, hoping it doesn't get lost in the junk mail. Then you're going to get it and you have to sign it and you have to fill it out and you have to complete it and you have to mail it back. And if you have to mail it back, you have to mail it back in time. If you don't mail it back in time, it may or may not get counted. And if you don't sign it or you don't sign it properly, you don't fill it out properly, it may or may not get counted. You may or may not know that your ballot or your vote counted. So that's just part of it, right? And then we're a sanctuary state, which means that we allow non-citizens to come in here, and with a driver's license, they can come in here and live in America, even though they're not American citizens, don't have the right to vote. However, we give them a driver's license, and because this is what we call a motor voter state, anybody who gets a driver's license down to the age of 16, even though you can't vote until you're 18, gets a ballot in the mail. So Washington County is one of my counties. And there is a very, very high incidence of undocumented people living in Washington County because we have an agricultural base. I understand that. Yamhill County, same way. I understand that. And they're needed. They're part of the economy. I'm not saying they all need to go. However, they are definitely, absolutely, without question, going to influence our vote, even if they don't vote, right? Even if someone who is a non-citizen comes and lives here and doesn't vote, but they tell their American neighbor or their American coworker, oh, I hate that so-and-so. Oh, he's a jerk. Well, they can't vote, and yet they're providing an influence that is an undue influence on American voters. So when Democrats talk about Russian influence and Chinese influence, the absolute worst influence on the American election is from citizens of Mexico and Central and South America that live here illegally in the United States. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. That's all the questions I have. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I just think it's a great opportunity. I appreciate it. I hope I wasn't too long-winded, but I have a very, very high level of energy for this position. I'm very excited to represent the people. I want to hear everyone's opinions. So I have a Facebook page and a website to be able to do that. Please send me an email or give me a call. And regardless of who you decide, please vote. Your vote is important. Our future is important. And especially for young people, when you start to vote, it really helps you to figure out how you think on issues, right? Because people are really going to ask you what you think about these same issues that you're asking me about. So thank you for asking me. And I hope you all have a chance to think about how you would answer these same questions yourself.
Happy Monday! Today I talked to Chris Christensen. He's running for Oregon's 1st Congressional District, which covers Clatsop, Columbia, Washington, Yamhill, and a part of Multnomah County. The incumbent for this position is the Democrat Representative Suzanne Bonamici. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Young Republicans of Oregon podcast. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please consider donating by visiting our website, youngrepublicansoforegon.org. The donations will pay for political trainings for our volunteers, travel expenses so we can spread our message across the U.S., and better tech equipment. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have new episodes every other Monday.